Good afternoon. My name is Nury Turkel. I am the chairman of the board for the Uyghur Human Rights Project. We are pleased to have the opportunity to speak with Professor Sean Roberts on his important book, The War Against the Uyghurs, China's internal campaign against a Muslim minority. Professor Roberts is one of the foremost experts on the securitization of the Uyghur region, and his study of the region goes back almost 30 years, long before the current atrocity crimes committed against the Uyghur people in East Turkestan. He has been a long-time friend of the UHRP, attending conferences, events organized by Uyghurs at the time when many academics chose not to do. Professor Roberts' new book is an important contribution to our understanding of the motivations behind the Chinese government's policies in the Uyghur region. Contrary to the increasingly loud justifications that the CCP is using to justify the mass detentions and its totalitarian police state, there is no substance to the assertion that the government is countering an international terrorist threat. Instead, it's a pretext for the mass detention, forced labor, population transfer, family separation, and attacks on the Uyghur language and identity are at the center of the attempt to eliminate the Uyghurs as a distinct people. These policies amount to cultural genocide and meet the criteria for the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. We'd like to begin by asking a rather simple question. Professor Roberts, why did you choose this topic, and why did you decide to publish this book now?
Well, first of all, I started to get interested in the topic of the impact of the global war on terror on Uyghurs. Well, initially, really starting with 2001, I remember I went to Kazakhstan to visit some scholars that I had worked with previously there. I think it was probably about 2002, and they were very upset that the United States had recognized a Uyghur group as being a terrorist organization, and they were very concerned that this was going to have impact on the Uyghur people around the world, including Kazakhstan and China, obviously, and elsewhere. And I had been kind of tracking that ever since 2001, 2002, but I really started to seriously try to look at the accusations that the Chinese government was putting forth about 2011. And I think it was one of the motivating factors was I was invited to speak at a congressional hearing, and there was a representative Delahunt at the time, and I think you may have been there, Nury.
Yes.
And it was this issue about Uyghur terrorism, and that really inspired me to dig deeper. And actually, at that time, I was over in Europe, and I decided to take a short trip to Albania to interview some of the Uyghurs who'd been in Guantanamo Bay, and that kind of started the project back in around 2011. When I had a sabbatical around 2015-16, I decided I was going to try to write a book about this. And of course, this was all before things got really, really bad in the Uyghur region. So, the book initially was supposed to be looking at the question of how the global war on terror was impacting Uyghurs, and also investigating China's claims that it faces a significant terrorist threat from Uyghurs. And that's still a very central part of the book, but unfortunately, as I was writing it, it became necessary to also explain how and why the Chinese policies in the Uyghur region have spiraled into a cultural genocide.
This is 9/11, China's counter-terrorism claim against Uyghur people is also had an effect on my personal and professional life. I was I was in my third week in law school when 9/11 happened, and then soon after that, China started making a terrorist claim, and I've been immersed in this topic ever since. I always try to figure out what is the definition of terrorist, what terrorism. Where the Uyghurs, disgruntled Uyghurs, a group of Uyghurs, resentment against the Chinese government or Chinese military police establishment, if that constitutes or meets the definition of commonly accepted terrorism claim. If you can comment on that, would be great.
Yeah, you know, it's very interesting. Right when I started looking at this question, one of the first things I did was start looking at how do scholars define terrorism and how do states define terrorism. And I was shocked actually to find out that, you know, and this was about a decade into the war on terror, I was shocked to see that there really is no international consensus on what constitutes terrorism or a terrorist. And I think that I make this point in my book, I think it's a serious problem with the global war on terror because it's allowed states, and China's not the only one, it's allowed states to target domestic opponents, political opponents, people who have grievances, and call them terrorists, particularly if they're Muslim, because you know, since 9/11, there's been kind of equating the idea of terrorism with a certain aspect of Islam, and I think that's, you know, that's completely counterintuitive. So one of the things I set out in my book at the beginning is to define at least what I'm talking about when I say a terrorist act, because if I'm trying to analyze the violence that took place in the Uyghur region that the Chinese government has characterized as terrorism, I need a normative definition to decide myself, does this constitute terrorism according to me? So in my perspective, terrorism should be defined by the actual act, what people are doing. It shouldn't be defined by some sort of ideology. It shouldn't be defined about people's identity. And it shouldn't actually even be defined by what their political goals are. Terrorism really is, I think the thing that is disturbing to everybody about terrorist acts is when they deliberately target civilian populations. And you know, I was able to kind of link that as well. And I have to mention that, you know, I found a very compelling essay by an Israeli terrorism expert who, writing in 2002, right after the war began, said exactly this, that we need to have a normative definition, and that definition should be about the targeting of civilians. And then perhaps you can stop groups from targeting civilians if you're able to identify that as essentially a war crime. And that really holds non-state actors accountable to the same rules of engagement in conflict that states are held to. Because states, it's considered a war crime if the state deliberately targets a civilian population. And so by that definition, really changes looking at all of the violence that's happened in the Uyghur region since 1990. And you know, I think we should also note that violence has not been significant by any stretch of the imagination, but analyzing it with that definition, you find very few incidents that I think qualify as terrorist acts. There are a couple, but that there's very few of them, to be perfectly honest.
That's very helpful. You talked about this a lot in the beginning of your book, and then is there any country or international entity kind of leads or provides a more logical, acceptable definition? Because it is becoming a kind of a political tool for repressive regimes, including Bashar Assad of Syria. He's calling early on when people protesting as terrorists. This is a kind of a clumsy terminology that governments around the world uses against political resentment, opposition, if you will, even in the peaceful manner. Is there any country that can be reasonably provide? I mean, United States does not really in a position to say this is what we can say terrorists or not, because there's some mistakes been done, in particular in the Uyghur case. Before the 9/11, the word terrorism did not even exist in the Uyghur dictionary. Because of the designation in 2002, the Chinese have been very effectively not only silencing the international community, trying to justify its crimes against the Uyghurs.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. There were some attempts in the mid 2000s to bring this discussion to the UN, or even I think before that, even before 9/11, and states are generally resistant to it because it's a convenient way to label any group and demonize that if they see that group as a threat, right? But I do think, I make this point at the end of my book. I think it would be very important to have this discussion brought up again at the UN, and there really needs to be some sort of international consensus on this, because the U.S. definition is not too bad, but it's imperfect. It says that it's premeditated political violence perpetrated against non-combatants. And I make this point that, if you're talking about non-combatants, the US government sees that as people not already involved in combat at the moment. Now, I think it's interesting, the PKK in Turkey, for example, tries to avoid targeting civilians because it feels that that would be considered terrorism. They're still considered terrorists by both, I think, the Turkish state and I think by the US. And I think that this is something that it really needs to be discussed, I think, on an international level, if there's any way to stop the type of things that are happening to Uyghurs happening to other people. I don't think, that discussion's not going to solve the crisis facing Uyghurs right now, unfortunately, because I think that, it's more, the crisis that Uyghurs are facing is more urgent. But I see what's happening to Uyghurs is a very dangerous precedent for what might happen to other Muslim minorities. And in some ways, I wonder, I have no kind of documentation to show this, but I wonder if the Chinese state looked at what Myanmar did to the Rohingya and saw the lack of international response and said, well, maybe we should be doing the same thing here. So I think that it's a very dangerous precedent, and I do hope, for getting beyond the war on terror, which is already the longest running war the U.S. has ever been involved in, it's critical that the international community comes to a consensus about what really constitutes a terrorist.
I'm personally grateful for you to mention that global aspect, global ramification of what the China is doing to the Uyghur people. Recently, we had a hearing at a commission that I'm serving as a commissioner, one of the witnesses told us that more than 80 countries have already adopted Chinese surveillance technology. And when you look at the list of countries, most of them are Muslim countries or authoritarian, run by authoritarian regime. When when you look at the Chinese counterterrorism claim, and in relation to what you were saying, they're also promoting this in official, as part of their official propaganda. About 2 years ago in the Global Times, I think, if I'm not mistaken, openly said that the countries should look at China model, countering extremism and terrorism. So they're promoting this collective punishment method or preemptive policing as the way to tackle political resentment or opposition and under the guise of countering extremism. So this is a dangerous trend. We've been telling, as you and I have been talking about these issues in various panels, that this has been a part of the conversation, that this is not only about the Uyghurs anymore. People need to pay attention. About 20 years ago, I think it was about right after 9/11 or around the time that the Obama administration took office, you and I spoke at Heritage Foundation. There was a guy showed up with a org chart claiming that Uyghur, so-called Uyghur terrorism has an international component. And now that we're seeing a bunch of experts, they did disappear. Those so-called terrorism experts now gone, and now we have the China experts writing papers. Some of them copying, pasting the Chinese claim. I've seen reports done by some academics explaining the Chinese counterterrorism or China's fight against three forces. Do you see any damage in that kind of hastily done research and reporting?
Yeah, no, and I talk about that. There's almost a whole chapter of my book where I look at this particular problem, because I look at the way that various Uyghur militant groups that have been identified abroad, how they've been characterized by analysts and sometimes scholars. I think it starts with, after 9/11, there was a proliferation of kind of a counterterrorism industrial complex. You had all kinds of people who were setting up consulting companies that would be doing analysis of what different terrorist groups are doing. Now, the groups, the two Uyghur groups that have been kind of charted by these people, and the people themselves, the analysts, tend to conflate them as one group. They are very much on the outskirts of the war on terror. They're mostly inconsequential, at least until very recently in Syria. And as a result, there was very little scrutiny of the work that was produced about these people. And for one thing, people weren't using Uyghur sources. The Turkistan Islamic Party, which is the group that emerges in 2008, which is that's when that Heritage Foundation meeting took place, was 2008, because this group emerged making videos threatening the Olympics, and consequently they became very prolific video producers. And one of the things I did in researching the book was I watched literally hundreds of their videos, and the lion's share of their videos are only available in the Uyghur language. And people, these analysts have often just watched the pictures and produced analysis of these videos without necessarily even translating them. Or they've just been taking those that have been translated into Arabic. They also suffer from, this is kind of like it's an echo chamber. So some of the early work produced about these groups was very flawed. It basically said all kinds of things that were unsubstantiated, but those get repeated because people quote things that were written elsewhere. And then this is also filtered into the academic literature, and in a lot of social sciences, there's a lot of comparative studies. So you'll see comparative studies on terrorism, and they'll take the China case, and they will take all of this very flawed literature and use that as data on the China case, comparing it to another case. And so I think this has been very dangerous because this Western knowledge production about terrorism has exacerbated the problems that Uyghurs have faced, and it's also helped justify China's claims that it faces a serious terrorist threat. Whereas in my research, I found that to the extent that there were any terrorist attacks in China, they took place primarily more than a decade after the Chinese government started suggesting that it faced a terrorist threat. And also, those very small number of terrorist incidents that appear to be Uyghur-led don't seem to have any connection to an international group whatsoever. And in fact, they're much more, I think, related to a response to state violence that has been in the guise of police harassment, police violence, security violence, mass arrests, and so on that took place, throughout the 2000s.
In the U.S. and Western media, oftentimes something related to the excellent points that you're making, that the academia, the policy folks, and the media oftentimes reports what Chinese said as if that's a verified fact. For example, in 2009, July 5 unrest resulted in 197 deaths, 2,000 injuries, and most of them Chinese. That's exactly what the Chinese said. Yeah. And then they cite a bunch of incidents without any verification, as if that somebody went there independently verified. So why this is happening? When the China says something on other issues, the public reaction is very skeptical. But when it comes to China's terrorism claim against Uyghur people, some fair-minded people, some experts, experienced, seasoned journalists take that as a face value. Why is that? This is one of the common questions that Uyghurs always talk.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I do think it has to do with the ways that Americans have kind of internalized the fear of terrorism too. I mentioned I started studying this problem early on, and in earnest about after 2011. And one of the reasons I started studying it is that no other scholars focused on Uyghurs really wanted to deal with this. And to some degree, the environment was such that I think people were scared of feeling that they could be wrong about something, and then later people saying, "Oh, see, you support terrorists," because we've kind of internalized this idea that terrorists are the kind of epitomation of evil, and that people want to avoid any relationship, perceived relationship with them. And and I've seen this also in the Uyghur community. I think the Uyghur communities felt very uncomfortable talking about this issue because they don't want to be perceived as kind of justifying something that might actually be a threat. And so I think that's it's dangerous because and I would have to place some blame on the early period after 9/11. I mean, in the US, people immediately afterwards, I don't know if people remember this, but I think it was Peter Jennings said right after the attacks on the nightly news, he said, we need to understand why these people hate us so much, which, you know, is a very intelligent thing to say, right? I mean, if somebody's attacking you, why do they, you know, are we doing something that is essentially angering them to the point that they're going to do something awful to us? You know, he was kind of suggesting that it was a time for the U.S. to reflect on what the U.S. was doing that would evoke this kind of violence against us. And he was immediately criticized, received death threats. You know, there were other reporters who got fired for saying things like this. You know, and there was such a sensitivity about it because it became, I think, in the American psyche, such a existential threat to America that people would try to just avoid it and would try to make sure that they were never perceived as somehow supporting it. And I think that unfortunately has made the information about terrorist groups and a terrorist threat has made it very one-sided and not very informative, and hasn't helped us kind of look at this problem in more depth.
When we I personally been very disturbed. There has been so many academic papers, policy papers, news reports have been done, and it may remain as an archive, and then future generation will cite it as it that has been verified. It's very distressful situation. So when you talked a lot about through the interview that the UHRP executive director, Americana, then was a reporter for RFA did. Through your research and what you have found out through your interview with individuals associated with them in Turkey and elsewhere, does the so-called Uyghur terrorism that China tried to make the world to believe has anything to do with international violence or global terrorism concerns?
You know, I think that you know, particularly when this happened in 2001. So it's important for people to know, if they don't know this background, that the Chinese government initially put out white papers about the terrorist threat that it faced. And this happened almost immediately after 9/11, and the Chinese government was really running a lobbying campaign to get other states to recognize a Uyghur terrorist threat. And the original documents that the Chinese government put out were almost laughable, because they would include virtually every Uyghur diaspora political organization around the world, you know, including groups in Germany, groups in Turkey and Kazakhstan. And I think that, you know, most governments who knew any of these groups knew that this was a ridiculous claim, that these groups were connected to al-Qaeda. And that's what the Chinese government was saying. And the Chinese government at the time said that I think it was 445 terrorist attacks had been carried out by this group, which it framed as a very amorphous Eastern Turkistan terrorist forces that include all of these diaspora groups, whether they were supporting human rights, whether they were, you know, more secularly based or more religiously based. And they said 445 terrorist attacks, 120 deaths, and or I'm sorry, it was 200 terrorist attacks, 120 deaths, and 445 injured, seriously injured people were affected by these terrorist attacks. And eventually, the U.S. in 2002 recognized one of these groups in Afghanistan. It called it the Eastern Turkistan Islamic Movement, which is what the Chinese white paper called this group. And when the U.S. recognized this group as a terrorist organization, it said that it was responsible for these 200 terrorist attacks, 120 deaths, and 445 seriously injured people. And that itself gave this organization even more credit than the Chinese government was giving credit as a threat, which made things, I think, even worse. But this group, I tried to do as much research as I could to understand what this group was. You know, initially, I had never even heard of the group, and I had been doing research at the time in Kazakhstan, and I knew all of the Uyghur nationalist groups, and I was sure I would know if there had been a group that was in Afghanistan preparing a militant insurgency inside China. But then later, when I interviewed people who were in Guantanamo Bay, it became much more clear to me what this was. It never really was an organization. It never called itself the Eastern Turkistan Islamic Movement. It was basically the initiative of one person, Hassan Massoum, who was religiously inspired. His religious mentor, was more inspired by Central Asian ideas of anti-colonial jihadism than by Salafism. And he went to Afghanistan and tried to get organized a training center to establish an insurgency. He was accused both by the Chinese state and then later by the US of having the support of al-Qaeda, but everybody I've talked to who had been at all involved in this group or even knew about it suggested that they never had good relations with al-Qaeda. And precisely because al-Qaeda was focused on a global jihad, and Hassan Massoum and the people who he was trying to train were only interested in liberating their homeland. Now, the other thing that's important to know about this group is it had no capacity, no resources whatsoever. And so it never even realized any of its goals. And I don't think there's any evidence that it ever carried out any violence whatsoever in China, let alone 200 terrorist attacks. And I think one of the most important things about, you know, kind of pointing to this group's mission and its lack of connection with the Taliban and al-Qaeda was Hassan Massoum called into Radio Free Asia after the 9/11 attacks, about within a year of that time. And he told Radio Free Asia that he and his group condemned the attacks, that they had no support from al-Qaeda or from the Taliban. And this was done from a secure location on a satellite phone. It wasn't under duress. And it's hard to believe that anybody who was aligned with al-Qaeda within a year of 9/11 from a secure location denying that they were connected with them, or even more importantly, condemning al-Qaeda and their actions. So I think this has to be believable that this group was really just focused on one issue, and that was the Uyghur homeland. And even in that, it was unable to do anything. So it was really no threat to anyone.
Thank you. On that note, you may recall that you and I both testified in that hearing. You joined us from, I believe you were in Kosovo and Albania when we had that hearing with Representatives Delhunt and Rohrabacher. One of the former Bush administration officials who were involved in this designation or assessment process told the Congress that it was a strategic blunder. Would you agree with that? And if that's what it is, then do you think that the United States government should publicly say something about that decision that has been used by the Chinese government for its repressive policies, now genocidal policies?
Yeah, I think that is a very good idea. I mean, I definitely think it was both a strategic blunder and disingenuous. Now, one thing that Rohrabacher refused to say in that hearing, which you might expect him to refuse to say, he refused to say that it was a politically motivated decision.
Right.
But most people who were analyzing this at the time said that this was very evidently a kind of a quid pro quo with China to recognize one small Uyghur group as a terrorist organization to ensure that China did not oppose the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which was already being planned in the summer of 2002 when the U.S. recognized this group, the Eastern Turkistan Islamic Movement, as a terrorist organization. So I think it was very much done for political reasons, which is very unfortunate. And I think it would be time, and I could see, either a Trump administration or a Democratic administration being able to say at this point, we're trying to slow down the whole war on terror. We're trying to disengage from this. There were lots of mistakes made, and these are some of the things that we regret that the U.S. government did before, because both the Trump administration and a Democratic administration, doesn't have any reason to answer necessarily for the things the Bush administration did. And I think it's time, it would be very helpful to hear that kind of humility from the U.S. government globally, because I think a lot of the excesses of the war on terror did a lot to denigrate American respect around the world.
Thank you. One small correction has been made. I should have mentioned this. One of those individuals on that list designated as terrorists have been protected actually by the United States government. Turkel was brought into the UN building by our former representative at the UN, Kelly Curry, Ambassador Curry, and also he has been granted a 10-year multiple entry visa to the United States from the no-fly or I don't know what list that he was on, but he was not allowed to the United States. So
I can mention also with that particular case and I think it's important because what people I think don't understand, and I think even probably when the U.S. government made this decision to recognize this group, they probably knew this group was inconsequential, and they probably thought, well, this isn't going to hurt anybody.
Right.
But the problem was then the Chinese government could associate any Uyghur who was an activist internationally, suggest that they were connected to this terrorist group, and they put in a red notice to Interpol that Nisa was connected to ETIM, and I've looked at what the Chinese announcement about this was, and they were making those kinds of accusations, and that really threatened all kinds of Uyghurs. And even though most politicians in the U.S. and Europe who maybe had met Gokun knew that he was not a terrorist, but once you get on one of these lists, that creates all kinds of problems in the bureaucracy in terms of your access to travel.
I can say this on the record that I represent him in that process. It's one of the best things that I've done with my law degree. Anyways, moving to the more current events unfolding, taking place in the last 3-4 years. Chinese still claims that they're doing this for national security purposes. And this is one of the most common justifications that their representatives, the diplomats at the UN, in the UK, here, saying day in, day out. I think for that precise reason, your book is increasingly important, significantly useful book for policymakers and lawmakers to read. Do you think that the Chinese government genuinely believe that this kind of perceived threat-based security policy will get them the ultimate stability that they're aiming for, quote unquote?
Mm-hmm.
As you know, when you look at the incidents that they cite, there's nothing that they can cite after 2015.
Yeah.
And these draconian policies put in place in starting April 2017. And they're still claiming that they're fighting this. And when you look at the official propaganda materials that they've been putting out, describing happiest Muslims around the world, they still cite those unverifiable violent incidents. So the question is, their perceived threat-based security policies would give them what they want in the end, or would that be a similar type of endless struggle for them as the United States or other countries have been engaging in real security threat issue?
Yeah, so there's a lot in that question. So let me unpack it a little bit. So first of all, I think that my feeling, when I looked at this in depth, I did not see any threat within China whatsoever at any point that was connected to international terrorist organizations. And I have to believe that the Chinese intelligence is capable enough to come to that same conclusion. So I think at the higher echelons of the state, I don't think they really believe that the Uyghur, that they face a Uyghur terrorist threat. That said, I do believe probably on the local level, people have internalized this themselves. And there's probably people who are carrying out these policies thinking that it is really for the betterment of the region and that it's to stop this existential terrorist threat. I think that that's very likely that there are people like that, but I don't think that at the higher echelons of Chinese power that they really believe that. I think what the Chinese government's really trying to do is they're trying to essentially settle the Uyghur region. I think this has more to do with the Uyghur region than the Uyghur people. In my book, I talk about it as essentially settler colonialism. And when you look at the things that the Chinese state is doing to Uyghurs, you can find lots of parallels from the 19th century, for example, and what the United States did to Native Americans, what Australia did to the Aboriginal population there, New Zealand, and so on. And in all those cases, eventually the states recognized that X had occurred, and they recognize these groups as the indigenous people of the region. But in the meantime, a lot of bad things happened to them, and they became marginalized. They became depopulated. They were displaced. And these seem to be the things that the Chinese government's trying to do in the Uyghur region now. And I think, in the 90s, I think ever since the 90s, the Chinese government has wanted to integrate this region. I think initially the approach was to be very hard on any signs of Uyghur dissent or disloyalty. But at the same time, there were lots of incentives for Uyghurs to integrate into China, to learn Chinese language, to study in Chinese universities. They were incentivizing a certain assimilation or at least acculturation into Chinese society. And at some point, I think around 2014 actually, when the People's War on Terror started under Xi Jinping, the whole tone of these campaigns changed, and it became, you know what, Uyghurs are superfluous to this situation. We're going to settle this area. We're going to make it look like the rest of China, and we're just going to take the Uyghurs out of the equation. And that requires, depopulating them, destroying their identity, their group solidarity, marginalizing them, trying to get forced assimilation among those who are willing to remain and be docile. And that's what it really feels like right now. And I don't think it has anything to do with a security fear. It's just this urgency to make this region much more an integral part of China. And I think to a certain degree, this relates to the urgency in Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy project, the Belt and Road Initiative, to make this area a significant node in that Belt and Road Initiative. But it's also related to the way I think Xi Jinping's government is looking at ethnic and cultural diversity writ large. So we're seeing, even though the state violence experienced by Uyghurs, which has been justified as counterterrorism, is much more extensive than what's happening to other non-Han people in China. Still, not all other non-Han people are also under a lot of threat in terms of their cultural expression. So we're seeing, the destruction of religious observation in Hui areas. We're seeing potentially, recently reports that they're also establishing mass internment centers in Tibet. And there's a campaign to get rid of the Mongolian language in Inner Mongolia. So, it seems that I think for Xi Jinping's state, part of their perception of what it is to be Chinese is very much dependent on being like the Han. And it doesn't include any kind of multicultural idea of the nation.
Thank you very much. You may have been following some of the social media discussions about genocide denialism. That has been very active since the summer. Uyghur community activists, especially those who have missing family members, camp survivors, are suffering double trauma on top of their personal grief and suffering as a result of their family members being disappeared. So why all of a sudden this people bringing up this whataboutism, genocide denial claims, and they're active participants in this discussion, and some of them happen to be based in China. Mm-hmm. So do you think that this has anything to do with the Chinese government's efforts to counter the international criticism, or this is something that people who have issues with the United States foreign policy objectives throughout the history and concerned that this must be something that some dark hands in the United States government has been orchestrating?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting because in the social sciences now, the art of spreading disinformation is getting more attention. And I've been trying to get some people interested, people who are able to do the kind of internet forensics and so on, investigative research to try to see, if there's clear indications that this is being propelled by the Chinese government, there's a high likelihood it is. But one of the things that's interesting about disinformation campaigns, and we've seen this, looking at the Russian interference in the US elections, it also relies on changing people's minds inside the country, and getting them to embrace it. So I think some of the denialism is also coming from people who may really believe this. And part of it is, I think, an unfortunate geopoliticization of the Uyghur issue. Because, as far as I'm concerned, what's happening to Uyghurs is a global humanitarian issue. We mentioned at the outset that this has global ramifications. And I think that it's something that people should care about just as humans, right? And I think a lot of people do care about it for that exact reason. However, I do see that in the last year in particular, as the US has become more engaged in conflict with China, there's a perception that the US support for the Uyghur issue is exclusively a geopolitical issue. And that immediately is a persuasive argument to people who already don't trust the US government, because they can say, oh, that makes sense. All right, so this is really just made up by the US government. Having lived in Washington, D.C. for a long time, cured me of believing any kind of conspiracy theories about the US government, because I just see how difficult it is for the US government to keep a secret, and how difficult it is for it to actually orchestrate some sort of mass conspiracy. However, I think a lot of people who have this idea of America as this hegemonic power think that it can just create these lies that will, motivate people around the world. And, that's really unfortunate. But, to go back to your original question, I'm really hoping some people who have done research on disinformation and, like, for example, the Russian disinformation around the 2016 election, some of those people should be looking at what's happening on social media around the Uyghur issue to see if there's similar patterns happening, if we can make similar connections.
I have this is a nice segue to some of the technical questions that I have for you in terminology. You cited UHRP staff member, Dr. Elise Anderson, the Uyghur region in your book, and you quite comfortably use the term East Turkestan. I believe that will delight the heart of many Uyghurs who would love to hear that every day instead of that colonial name. And you use the word colonial. You explain colonialism in very extensive nature in your book. So why did you why are you so comfortable using the word East Turkestan, where some academics don't like to use it because that may give an impression of you are supporting Uyghur separatism?
Well, yeah, I tried very carefully actually not to use either the word Xinjiang or the word Eastern Turkestan as my label for the region, right? Because I feel, and I have a section where I discuss that, that the conflict between those two names for the region show the conflict between modern China and Uyghurs. For Uyghurs, they see that as their homeland. For the Chinese government, which has never recognized really that it conquered this region, it tries to suggest that this has always been part of China. They see the name Eastern Turkestan as a reflection of extremism and terrorism. And for Uyghurs, understandably, they don't like the word Xinjiang, which is essentially new frontier, because that shows the relationship of this region to modern China. But one thing I feel very comfortable saying is that I do see this region as the Uyghur homeland. And that's partly from my work on indigenous rights. The idea of UN in I think 2011 passed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and they're very careful in that document to note that an indigenous population is not the first people from perpetuity, because we don't even have the scientific skills to understand who were the first people in any territory.
Right.
But the term indigenous is really about people who occupy the land to which it is very important to their identity, and that was conquered by an external power, and it's then politically marginalized. And in my mind, I know a lot of Uyghurs resist the term indigenous peoples because they resist identifying as an indigenous nation, but that's mostly because the term has taken on these negative connotations as somehow unmodern. But that's not really the way the term is used in international discourse. And for example, the World Bank, when the World Bank does work in the Uyghur region, it is supposed to follow its indigenous peoples protocol, because internationally Uyghurs are recognized as an indigenous people, even though the Chinese government does not recognize anybody in China as indigenous peoples. And so I feel very comfortable calling it the Uyghur homeland, because I think that is an objective description of what that territory is. And I kind of go between Uyghur region and Uyghur homeland. And I still try to do that. I think ever since writing the book, I try to resist using the word Xinjiang unless I'm talking specifically about its official name, or about an institution there that uses that name.
Thank you. I'd like to share a quick story with you. When we were discussing the text of the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, some Uyghur activists were very unhappy that Congress decided not to use the term East Turkestan, and look at the document, you see Xinjiang all over the place. And I went to talk to the staffers who were working on the actual text during the markup session. And one of them said, we'd be delighted to have it, but you cannot say Chinchengo Communist Party Secretary for East Turkestan. So you have to allow us to use Xinjiang when we're referencing to policies of the Chinese government, the official titles, but we try not to use it as much as we can. So that was the response. But at the same time, I think it's reasonable for Uyghur people to expect the international community, especially those who support the Uyghur cause, understands the Uyghurs' legitimate grievances, that it's okay to respect their desire. Recently, you may have noticed the spelling has changed after the enactment of the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. Now the UIGHUR is becoming new norm, but scholars like yourself have been using it for a long time. Gardner Bounden was right when he gave an interview in 2010 that the Chinese people like to call Beijing instead of Beiping or Peking. We go ahead with that terminology. Why not allowing the Uyghurs to use their own names as they desire? Same is true with the name East Turkestan. If you support Uyghurs' desire for self-determination, democratic freedom, then you should also allow them to use the name. You should not feel objected to that terminology because of what the Chinese will react. If we cannot conduct business based on what the Chinese government thinks. So that's my 2 cents on that point.
And just another point on that, something I do in my book, which I think Uyghurs will appreciate, most readers won't.
Yeah.
I avoid using the Chinese names of any places in the Uyghur region. I always use the Uyghur name, which is a problem because you'll see even journalistic accounts where they'll go between using the Uyghur name and the Chinese name for different places. So I tried very carefully to make sure that I didn't use the Chinese name for any of the villages. Sometimes it took a little bit of research to dig up the Uyghur name, actually, but because anywhere you'd see it in academic literature, it might be in the Chinese name.
Thank you. I have two more policy-oriented questions. One involves the ongoing policy deliberation and executive decisions being announced in Washington. You're an international development expert, in addition to being a professor at GW. Is there anything that the entities like a U.S. Agency for International Development can do to help the Uyghurs? As you know, that President Trump signed an executive order with $50 million budget to promote religious freedom through the agencies like USAID. And also, as you may have seen in the news, that United States government has been implementing whole government approach to address the Uyghur atrocities. Except for a few agencies, we've been hearing from the cabinet level officials from anywhere, DOJ, DHS, Commerce Department, Treasury, and now the USAID acting administrator Barsa was talking about the Uyghurs, and now he's organizing an event next week. So I'd be interested to know if there's anything that we can ask the USAID to do under the executive order.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that would be really appropriate for USAID to do is to help provide services for Uyghur refugees in different places, right? And that could be all kinds of resources. I mean, things that USAID does do projects with refugees in other parts of the world, and sometimes it involves helping them establish their own businesses. It could be about education. It could be, helping provide people with a source for Uyghur language education. It could be about ensuring that they know their rights in the countries they're in and how to access services. These are all things that people face who are refugees. I think obviously, people have asked me in the past about whether anybody can do anything for the Uyghurs inside China. And I think that that's, unrealistic at this point. I mean, beyond trying to raise the issue, but, having any access to those people to provide them assistance is virtually impossible. But there are Uyghurs who, because of this crisis, have been caught around the world in very tenuous positions. And I remember over the last 2 years, some Uyghur activists have done a really good job, essentially spreading information where Uyghur has been stuck, let's say, in an airport.
Yeah.
Who is about to be perhaps sent back on a plane to China because at the airport they don't recognize their visa or their passport is expired or something. Establishing some sort of resources for all those people who've been caught outside of China, and in most cases don't have necessarily definite statuses in the countries where they're living. A lot of them don't have refugee status. For example, they don't recognize the many Uyghur refugees there as refugees, and as a result, they have this very tenuous position. So, I mean, I think that would be something that would be very useful to have development organizations working on, in helping people have access to information, access to education, access to the ability to have a livelihood through establishing businesses and so on, and having information about their rights.
Thank you. You and I can talk about these issues. I continue to have this conversation, but I should also give a chance to other people to ask questions. But before we move on to the Q&A session, I have one rather simple question, actually two. What concerns you the most about the future of the Uyghur people? One, and then on the positive side, do you see any positive things that are happening that may help the Uyghur people to see regain their semi-freedom or dignity back some way, somehow?
Mm-hmm. So my biggest fear, and in the conclusion of my book, I have a very bleak of what these policies could end up looking like. We could end up where the Uyghur region, let's say if these policies more or less continue over the next 10 years, you could see a situation where the Uyghur region no longer has really hardly any characteristics as being the Uyghur homeland, the exception of some tourist attractions that might be kept to kind of provide tourists with an idea of the exotic past of it. You could see the Uyghur population significantly depopulated. We've heard evidence of birth control measures, sterilization. We see massive amounts of people interned or imprisoned who may just live out the rest of their lives in those institutions. And those people left, may have no choice but to completely assimilate if they want to have any sort of livelihood whatsoever. So I mean, in I think the bleakest situation I could see, I don't really liken as much what's happening to Uyghurs to the Holocaust, which was a slightly different context, but more to what we see happen to Native Americans. Where Native Americans once lived throughout the United States, they're now isolated on reservations. They've been marginalized significantly. There is kind of a slow correction to that, where you see people who are able to now assert their identity after having established themselves in American society, but they're certainly marginalized within the population as a whole. Politically, we don't see massive numbers of Native Americans in Congress, for example. So I could see the Uyghurs really being essentially removed from their homeland, and only being a very incidental, marginalized part of that society. I hope that doesn't happen. I think my sense is the problem is the situation has already gone to such an extent that it would be very difficult to reverse it at this point. Because I think I imagine that a lot of these people who've been imprisoned and interned, if they were just suddenly let out, they would be extremely angry, or they should be, about what's been done to them.
Yeah.
It's going to create a massive problem for China. And the only way I see out of it is really, a change in the Chinese government that includes a mea culpa, saying, listen, the people who were in power did these very horrible things to you. We are going to correct that. We apologize for that. But, I think anybody who studies Chinese politics knows that that's not going to happen very quickly. Now, in terms of positive things, to me, what's been really positive is, I've been studying Uyghurs for 30 years and have met people who've been involved as activists for that same amount of time. I know them, and those people have been very important to trying to keep the Uyghur issue on the agenda around the world. But now we're seeing that almost every Uyghur outside of China has been activated. And I find it intriguing because it really reflects the full diversity of Uyghur culture. I mean, you have people of all different kind of political persuasions, different generations, even different religious persuasions, who are taking up this cause, and we're in a time where through social media and so on, people are able to do that. So I think that's a really great thing, but you really hate to see the silver lining in this situation being that Uyghur culture outside the homeland thrives, while the culture inside the homeland gets essentially destroyed.
Thank you. I'm glad that you mentioned the positive side of it, because this is a very distressful situation, it's a hopeless situation, emotionally tormenting experience. So we have to also keep a positive attitude that while China is trying to prevent the Uyghur issue from becoming a global issue, now it's a global issue. Even it's a campaign issue in the United States. Both presidential candidates had to take a position. It's amazing. It's incredible. I've been doing this for almost 2 decades. I never thought that the presidents will, challenging each other who takes the harder position. And also, you're absolutely right that even Rehanes, and one of the victims, said in her interview to New York Times that she didn't want to be a political activist, but now the Chinese made her a political activist. This has been the case in many Uyghur activist situations. So yeah, so the Chinese, so much so for Chinese wisdom, strategic thinking, believing that they can get away with this. With that, I'd like to pose a first question from one of our participants. Professor Roberts, in your book, you called what the Chinese regime doing currently to the Uyghur people as a cultural genocide. However, more and more voices are advocating for calling it genocide, straight up genocide. Can you elaborate the reason why you chosen the term with the adjective cultural genocide?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think this is an important question, because I know a lot of Uyghurs on social media will ask me about this. I think that what's important to understand is genocide should be essentially a legal term, and I think it's completely legitimate, and I think it's a really great development that we have people, legal minds, looking at this and trying to categorize it as genocide. I don't think if you put an adjective before genocide, that should necessarily lessen the idea of a genocide. It just is a way to characterize what kind of genocide it is. As I mentioned, I see what's happening to Uyghurs to be much more like what has been done to indigenous peoples in lots of contexts, in Canada, in the United States, in Australia. It's very much a pattern of settler colonialism. So where you have these states that have been settled by external powers, what's done to the people inside them. And if you look on the internet, there's I think fairly broad consensus that what happened to Native Americans was genocide. But you also see it called cultural genocide, because the attack is to essentially destroy these people, not necessarily exterminate their genes in every one of them, but to destroy their identity and their solidarity. I think it's a term I think that's useful in my book, and I think that shouldn't lessen or change any of the legal efforts to try to investigate whether this characterize a violation of the UN Convention on Genocide.
Thank you. I think eventually this will be clarified. There's an active deliberation and discussion as to what to call it and how to call it and how to address it in various places in the legal scholars community, among the war crimes experts, policy experts, national security experts. Soon we will be hearing from some entity. So the next question is related to the academic community in the United States. I mentioned your appearance and speaking on the Uyghur human rights and Uyghur related issues way back when no one is willing to show up in front of a microphone. So that seems to be still is the case, that the so-called China experts or China scholars are still self-censoring. So the question here is that do you see Western academics falling prey to CCP influence in their research, and how long the self-censorship will continue?
Yeah. So it's interesting because we saw something we saw kind of I think a seismic shift in the community of people who studied Uyghurs in the Uyghur region in 2017. So, I mean, I remember, being at conferences a while back where Radio Free Asia would want to interview a scholar, and most scholars didn't want to be interviewed, and I would agree to be interviewed. But something, changed because, I mean, all these people have very strong ties to Uyghurs in the Uyghur community, in different parts of the community, and all of them were affected. So, it was really kind of an amazing thing around late 2016, early 2017, I think it was, where some scholars started writing to each other and establishing kind of a big list saying, we have to speak out about this. We have to do something. Something very, very sinister is happening. And everybody knew it because everybody knew it from different places. They knew it from the people they had worked for who had disappeared, the people they had worked with who disappeared, the people who they had done interviews with who had disappeared, their friends, some people, their family members. And so I don't see in the Uyghur studies community right now any self-censorship whatsoever, which I think is a great thing.
Right.
It's been a debate in China studies for a little while. The last few years, there's been some heated debates about it. I'm more of a scholar of Central Asia than of China. Mm-hmm. I long ago decided when the government of China basically banned all the people who contributed to one volume about the Uyghur region that I would not really necessarily try to get a visa again because, I didn't feel that I should censor myself for that, and I had other options. I could work in Central Asia. I think for a lot of China scholars, there's an uncomfortable balance they're trying to maintain because nobody really wants to consciously self-censor, and most of the self-censorship you see is more in terms of what they can study. Some people want to maintain that ability to enter China because it is important that we have people who are able to get into China and are able to do research. but I think it's a very difficult question. I think people should respect that. I don't think people in this field of study, necessarily censor what they say, as much as also what happens is when a state creates these norms for international academics, sometimes people just internalize them. I mean, there's a fantastic essay written by James Millward a couple weeks ago where he talks about his idea of the history of China has changed, and he now can realize how so much of it in the past had been influenced by what the Chinese state was trying to portray the history of China as. And so, I think I think it's not as much of a conscious, I don't think there's people who are at this point, trying to be soft on China to ensure they have a visa. It's more just the restrictions on research that tend to limit our knowledge. And people, scholars sometimes have to play that game.
You may have noticed, or read, Mark Cuban, one of the wealthiest people in the United States, recently could not even condemn China after being pressed multiple times. So the athletic clubs, the Hollywood studios, and academic institutions need to get on the right side of the history.
Yeah, Hollywood's going to be a big issue, actually, because right now that's where they're making the majority of their revenue from film.
Right. Under the normal circumstance, I think you would agree, in award ceremonies and social media, if it was not China-related atrocities, you would hear luminaries, heads of state, former, current, Hollywood stars, athletes would be doing symbolically, verbally to protest. Nothing has happened so far. So it's very disappointing. We have a few minutes left. I think we can afford another question. This is more about what to do to help. One of the questions was that what can we do to help with governments and civil societies to assist the Uyghur diaspora who's facing threats, intimidation from communist Chinese regime? I can throw in another question. What young students or society communities could do to help organizations like UHRP or individual victims or survivors?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, again, that's another area where USAID has a lot of expertise, is in helping with organizational development, and I think there's a need to support these organizations. One thing that I've for a long time have been trying to kind of pitch to Uyghur activists is the idea of really doing much more work on college campuses. And I think that this is right now, I'm seeing a lot of young people become very interested in this issue, even younger than college. I mean, in high school, a friend of mine's daughter in high school asked for my book because she's been kind of obsessed with this issue. So those people are the people who can really make things happen, I think, in society and activism. Maybe even considering chapters at colleges, that are affiliated with different Uyghur organizations like UHRP, that could help in distributing petitions, in terms of having information sessions on campus. I mean, of course, we're in an odd period right now everything virtual. But even in that context, I think there's a lot that can be done. So I would recommend to any young person who's interested in this issue to reach out to the Uyghur Human Rights Project, which is, a great group, and they know other groups that may also need assistance. I think they would be happy to bring on more people to this issue.
Thank you. If I may add, using this remaining of the time, there are a couple of things that the various communities and students can do. One, lend your voice. Simply saying, I'm sorry this is happening to you is not enough. Expression of concern is not enough. The action, specific action, lending your voice. Be voice for those who have been subject to this modern day genocidal policies. And also open up your wallet. I never say this, but I'm quite comfortable saying it now because organizations like UHRP need your help. Go to uhrp.org and click donate a link and make a donation. With the professional operations that the UHRP is doing, need a lot of financial support. The amount of work has been increased, but the resources remain to be the same, or even at a level going down the hill. So your financial support is much appreciated. With that, I'd like to thank the UHRP for arranging this session. We will be doing more of similar events in the future, speaking with policy experts, renowned scholars like Professor Roberts, to learn and educate public about the Uyghur atrocities. I am profoundly grateful for UHRP staff, Mustafa Aksu, Nicole Mogret, Elise Anderson, and UHRP's Executive Director, Umar Kanat, for allowing me this chance to have this thoughtful conversation with my friend, Professor Roberts. I also wanted to thank the audience for taking the time to join us. This has been an honest session. This is one of the topics that I've been, as I mentioned, immersed in the almost last 2 decades. So it's been an amazing learning experience for me. We have talked about actions the Chinese government, other governments and private actors like the think tank, so-called experts and media. This topic is very relevant. This is, when you mention terrorism, 9/11 comes to mind, but this is some of the main reasons that the Chinese government formulated, implemented the ongoing genocidal policies on World's Watch, building the industrial scale prison system, collectively punishing Uyghur people in the camps and in society. With that, I'd like to conclude today's session. Professor Roberts, thank you so much for the opportunity to have this conversation with you. I appreciate it, and I recommend everyone to read this book. This is an amazing book. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for hosting this. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Thank you.